My husband's best friend kept sleepwalking into our bed and cuddling him. I decided to heal her completely. My husband Jordan's best friend Megan started sleepwalking into our bed every time she stayed over, always ending up on his side pressed against him while I woke up to find another woman wrapped around my husband. The first time it happened in January, Megan was staying in our guest room after a night out, and I woke up at 3 a.m. to find her under our covers with her arms around Jordan's waist. Jordan woke up confused and Megan acted shocked, claiming she had no memory of walking to our room and must have been sleepwalking because she'd done it since childhood. She apologized profusely and said how embarrassing it was while wearing tiny pajamas that barely covered anything. Jordan believed her immediately and said we shouldn't make her feel bad about a medical condition she couldn't control. He actually comforted her while she cried about being so humiliated, hugging her in our bed while I stood there watching. The second time happened 2 weeks later when Megan stayed over after dinner, and again she ended up in our bed at 2 a.m., this time with her leg thrown over Jordan's body. She claimed the guest bed triggered her sleepwalking episodes because it was unfamiliar, and maybe she needed to sleep on our couch instead. Jordan said that was ridiculous, and she should just stay in the guest room, but maybe leave the door locked so she couldn't wander. But somehow she still managed to unlock the door in her sleep and find her way to Jordan's side of our bed perfectly, without bumping into anything or making noise. I suggested Megan stop staying over if she had such severe sleepwalking, but Jordan said I was being cruel to someone with a medical issue. He said Megan couldn't help it and we needed to be understanding friends. He actually got angry when I said it was suspicious that she only sleepwalked to his side of the bed and never got lost or went anywhere else. He said I was accusing his friend of lying about a serious condition, and that showed what kind of person I was. By February, Megan was staying over every weekend and sleepwalking into our bed like clockwork. She'd always end up spooning Jordan or having him spoon her, claiming she had no memory of it happening. Jordan started expecting it and would just let her stay when she showed up instead of waking her because he said disturbing sleepwalkers was dangerous. I'd wake up to find my husband cuddling another woman who'd conveniently worn silk nightgowns or lacy underwear to sleep in. When I said sleepwalkers don't usually change into sexy clothes first, Jordan said I was sexualizing a medical emergency and being jealous of someone who needed help. Megan started telling our friends about her terrible sleepwalking condition that only happened at our house and how sweet Jordan was for not making her feel bad about it. She'd dramatically describe waking up confused in our bed with no memory while Jordan protected her from my accusations. Our friends started thinking I was heartless for not being sympathetic to Megan's condition. Some even suggested Jordan was such a good friend for handling it so maturely while I was being petty and suspicious. That's when I decided to cure Megan's sleepwalking permanently. I started by installing a lock on our bedroom door that could only be opened from inside, telling Jordan it was for Megan's safety, so she couldn't accidentally hurt herself trying to get in. The first night with the lock, we heard Megan trying the handle at 2 a.m., jiggling it repeatedly and even knocking softly. Jordan wanted to let her in, but I said that would encourage her sleepwalking, and we needed to break the pattern. We listened to her try to get in for 20 minutes before she gave up. The next morning, Megan said she'd had the worst night's sleep because her sleepwalking had been frustrated, and she'd woken up exhausted in the hallway. Jordan felt terrible, but I said this proved she was getting better since she'd woken up instead of wandering more. I suggested she see a sleep specialist since her condition was so severe and offered to go with her for support. Megan quickly said that wasn't necessary and her sleepwalking was actually improving. Next, I started setting up obstacles between the guest room and ours like chairs in the hallway and a baby gate at the top of the stairs. Megan miraculously never hit any of them during her sleepwalking, navigating perfectly in the dark to reach our locked door. When I pointed this out, she said muscle memory guided her, but couldn't explain how muscle memory worked in a house she'd only started visiting recently. I then told Jordan we should help Megan by recording her sleepwalking to show doctors, and I set up motion-activated cameras in the hallway. Megan suddenly stopped sleepwalking completely, claiming the locked door had cured her because her subconscious knew it couldn't get in. But I'd already caught her on camera from earlier nights, fully awake, carefully walking to our room while checking if we were asleep. The best part was when I invited Megan's ex-boyfriend Paul to dinner without telling her. Paul showed up at 7:30 looking confused when I opened the door, and I watched Megan's face turn white as she stood behind me in the entryway. Jordan rushed over with a big smile and shook Paul's hand, asking how he'd been since they last saw each other at that work thing, while Megan made a weird choking sound and grabbed the wall for support. She stammered something about feeling sick suddenly and maybe needing to lie down, but I smiled and said dinner was ready and we should all sit before the food got cold. Paul kept glancing between Megan and me like he was trying to figure out what was happening, and Megan wouldn't look at him at all as we walked to the dining room. Jordan pulled out chairs for everyone and started talking about his latest project at work, completely missing how Megan's hands were shaking when she picked up her water glass. I served the pasta and salad while making small talk about the weather, waiting for the right moment to bring up the real reason I'd invited Paul over without telling anyone. About halfway through dinner, I mentioned how Megan had been dealing with this terrible sleepwalking problem that only seemed to happen at our house, and Paul's eyebrows shot up so fast I almost laughed. He put down his fork and looked at Megan with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between surprise and understanding, and Megan started eating faster like she wanted to finish and leave. Paul said he actually remembered Megan having a similar issue when they dated 3 years ago, except back then she kept sleepwalking into his roommate's bed instead of Paul's. Jordan stopped chewing and looked at Paul with interest, asking if she'd gotten help for it back then, and Megan kicked Paul under the table hard enough that he winced. Paul ignored her and kept talking, explaining how the sleepwalking mysteriously stopped after his roommate installed a lock on his bedroom door and caught her on camera one night trying the handle while fully awake. Jordan's fork paused halfway to his mouth and stayed there for a few seconds while he processed what Paul just said, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he started connecting the dots. Megan tried to laugh it off and said Paul was remembering wrong, that she'd never done anything like that. But her voice came out too high and shaky to be convincing. She tried to change the subject by asking Paul about his new job, but Paul kept going and described how his roommate had set up a camera after the third time it happened. He said the footage showed Megan walking normally to the door, checking to make sure nobody was watching, and then carefully trying the handle multiple times before finally giving up and going back to the guest room. Jordan set his fork down completely now and stared at Megan with this look I'd never seen before, like he was seeing a stranger instead of his best friend. Megan's face turned red and she insisted Paul was lying to cause trouble, that he'd always been jealous of her friendship with Jordan, but nobody at the table believed her anymore. I excused myself to get dessert and came back carrying my laptop instead of cake, and Megan's eyes went wide when she saw what I was holding. I set it on the table and opened it to the folder where I'd been saving all the hallway camera footage from the past 2 weeks, and clicked on the first video. The screen showed Megan walking down our hallway at 2 in the morning, checking her phone for the time and then approaching our bedroom door with careful steps. She tried the handle once, twice, 3 times, each attempt getting more forceful, before she finally gave up and walked back to the guest room with her shoulders slumped. Jordan leaned forward to see the screen better, and his face went completely blank, like his brain had stopped working while it tried to make sense of what he was watching. Megan started crying immediately and saying the camera must be wrong somehow, that she had no memory of any of this happening and maybe she was doing it in her sleep without knowing. Paul shook his head slowly and told Jordan this was exactly what she'd done to him 3 years ago, using the same excuses and tears to make everyone feel bad for her. He said his roommate had felt so uncomfortable that he'd almost moved out before they finally confronted Megan with the evidence, and even then she'd tried to claim it was some kind of medical condition. Jordan just kept staring at the laptop screen where the video was playing on loop, showing Megan clearly awake and aware as she tried to get into our bedroom. I didn't say anything, just let him watch and process what he was seeing with his own eyes, instead of taking my word for it like I'd been asking him to do for months. Megan switched her approach and started begging us to understand that she must have a serious medical condition that made her appear awake while she was actually sleeping, that there were documented cases of people doing complex tasks while unconscious. She grabbed Jordan's arm and pleaded with him not to judge her for something she couldn't control, tears running down her face as she insisted she would never deliberately do something so awful. I calmly clicked to the next video, which showed Megan standing in our hallway texting on her phone before walking to our door and trying the handle. Then I played another video from a different night where she was scrolling through something on her phone screen, the light illuminating her face clearly as she stood outside our bedroom. I played a third video showing her checking the time, sighing in frustration when the door wouldn't open, and then typing out a text message before heading back to the guest room. Jordan pulled his arm away from Megan and asked her to explain how someone who was asleep could text on their phone and check the time, and Megan's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. Jordan's voice shook when he finally asked Megan directly why she would do this to him, why she would lie to his face for months and make him defend her against his own wife. Megan tried one more time to insist it wasn't what it looked like, that the videos were somehow misleading or taken out of context, but Jordan cut her off and asked her to just tell him the truth. Megan's face changed then, the tears stopping like someone had flipped a switch, and she stood up from the table so fast her chair fell backward. She shouted that we were both terrible friends who didn't understand real mental health struggles, that Jordan was choosing his jealous wife over someone who'd been there for him for years. She grabbed her purse and coat from the hall closet and stormed out of our house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The 3 of us sat in silence for a minute, listening to her car start and speed away down our street. Paul was the first to speak, apologizing for not warning us earlier about Megan's behavior patterns. He explained that after their relationship ended and his roommate moved out, he'd assumed Megan had gotten professional help and worked through whatever was going on with her. He told Jordan that his former roommate Alexander had been so uncomfortable with Megan's nighttime visits that it affected his sleep and mental health, and their whole friend group back then had known Megan had serious boundary issues. Paul said Alexander eventually moved across town just to get away from the situation, and several people had stopped inviting Megan to gatherings because she made their partners uncomfortable. Jordan listened without interrupting, his face getting paler as Paul described incident after incident that sounded exactly like what had been happening in our house. Paul finished by saying he'd hoped Megan had changed in the past 3 years, but clearly she'd just found new people to target with the same manipulative behavior. Jordan sat frozen in his chair for almost an hour after Paul left, not touching his cold dinner or responding when I asked if he wanted anything. I watched him cycle through different emotions, his face showing anger and then guilt and then confusion, and then back to anger again. He kept picking up his phone like he wanted to call or text someone, then putting it back down without doing anything. I didn't push him to talk or try to make him feel better, just cleared the dinner dishes quietly and sat on the couch where he could see me if he needed me. I could tell he was processing the fact that his best friend had deliberately manipulated him for months, made him doubt his wife's sanity, and turned him into someone who defended boundary violations and gaslighting. The weight of realizing he'd been completely wrong about someone he trusted was crushing him, and he needed time to work through it on his own terms. The next morning, Jordan called Megan before I was even fully awake, and I could hear him talking in the kitchen while I got dressed. His voice was firm when he told her she wasn't welcome at our house anymore, and needed to get professional help for her behavior. I walked in to find him pacing by the counter with his phone pressed to his ear, and I could hear Megan's voice getting higher and more desperate through the speaker. She tried the crying routine again, sobbing about how everyone was abandoning her, and she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. Jordan cut her off and said he'd seen the videos himself and knew she was lying about everything. Paul had confirmed she'd done this exact same thing in her previous relationship. Megan's crying stopped abruptly, and she started yelling that he was a terrible person for believing lies about her, but Jordan just ended the call and blocked her number right there while I watched. I spent the next few days watching Jordan process everything while keeping my distance emotionally. He'd pick up his phone to text someone and then put it down again, his face showing confusion and hurt. I could tell he wanted to reach out to Megan or maybe defend her still, but the evidence was too clear to ignore anymore. On Thursday morning, my phone started blowing up with texts from our friend group. I opened the messages to find Megan had sent a long post to everyone claiming I'd manipulated the camera footage using editing software and convinced Jordan to abandon her during a serious mental health crisis. She wrote that she was devastated her best friend believed his controlling wife over her, and asked everyone to pray for Jordan because he was clearly being isolated. My hands shook as I read her twisting everything to make me look like the villain. 3 different friends texted Jordan within an hour asking if he was okay, and if I was preventing him from talking to people. Jordan's face went red as he read the messages, and he actually threw his phone across the room onto the couch. He paced around our living room for 10 minutes before picking it back up and opening our group chat. I watched him type out a response, delete it, and start over twice before finally sending something. He wrote that Megan was caught on camera multiple times fully awake and deliberately trying to enter our bedroom, not sleepwalking like she claimed. He explained that her ex-boyfriend Paul had confirmed she did the exact same thing in a previous relationship and that his former roommate had to move out because of her behavior. Jordan finished by saying he was disappointed. So many people assumed his wife was lying without ever asking for his perspective or looking at the evidence themselves. His message sat there in the chat for almost 20 minutes with nobody responding. Then Kira sent a private message just to me saying she needed to apologize. She wrote that she'd taken Megan's side automatically without hearing me out first, and she felt terrible about it. Kira admitted she found it easier to believe a medical condition than to consider that someone they all liked would do something so manipulative and creepy. She asked if we could meet for coffee so she could apologize in person. I agreed, and we met at a cafe near my work the next afternoon. Kira looked uncomfortable when she sat down across from me, fidgeting with her coffee cup and not making eye contact at first. She started by saying she was sorry for not believing me when I tried to explain what was happening. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop. She confessed that Megan had tried to cuddle with her husband during a movie night at their place last year, when Kira went to the bathroom. Megan had scooted right up against him on the couch and put her head on his shoulder, claiming she was cold and just being friendly when Kira came back. Kira had brushed it off as awkward social skills at the time, but now she could see it was part of a bigger pattern. She said her husband had mentioned feeling uncomfortable, but they'd both decided not to make it weird by bringing it up. I thanked her for telling me and said I understood how hard it was to see someone you trust in a different light. Over the weekend, more stories started coming out from our friend group. Another couple admitted Megan had made inappropriate comments about the husband's body during a pool party and touched his chest while laughing it off as a joke. Someone else mentioned she'd sat in their boyfriend's lap at a barbecue claiming all the chairs were taken, even though there were empty seats everywhere. Another friend said Megan had asked her husband for a back rub at a dinner party and got mad when he refused. Jordan sat on our couch reading all these messages with his head in his hands. He looked devastated as he realized he'd spent months defending someone who made multiple people uncomfortable, but nobody wanted to speak up about because she was his best friend. I felt bad for him even though part of me was still angry he hadn't believed me sooner. On Sunday afternoon, my sister Eliza drove up from 2 hours away after I called her and told her everything that happened. She walked into our house and immediately hugged me for a solid minute without saying anything. Then she turned to Jordan and told him directly that he owed me a massive apology for dismissing my concerns so completely. She said I'd spent months being gaslit and isolated while he chose to believe someone else over his own wife. Jordan nodded and said he knew he'd messed up badly. Eliza didn't let him off easy, though. She listed specific times I'd called her crying because I felt crazy and alone in my own home while Jordan defended Megan. She told him that kind of damage doesn't just go away because the other person is gone now. Jordan listened without trying to defend himself, and when Eliza finished, he turned to me. He apologized for real this time, not just saying sorry, but actually listing out each time he'd dismissed what I said and made me feel like I was being jealous or paranoid. He admitted he was, so invested in seeing Megan as his harmless best friend that he refused to consider she could be manipulative. Jordan said he understood if I was angry with him for choosing her word over mine repeatedly, and he wanted to work on rebuilding my trust however long that took. I told him I appreciated the apology, but we needed to actually address what happened, not just say sorry and move on. We scheduled a couples therapy session for the following week, because even though Megan was gone, the damage to our marriage from months of him dismissing me needed to be worked through properly. The therapist we saw was a woman in her 50s who listened to both of us explain what happened without interrupting. She helped Jordan understand how his defensiveness had made me feel crazy and alone in my own home. He'd been so worried about seeming like a jealous or controlling husband that he'd overcorrected by dismissing legitimate concerns. The therapist pointed out that trusting your partner isn't the same as being controlling, and that he'd actually damaged our marriage more by refusing to believe me. On Tuesday, Jordan got a message from Nolan, one of his coworkers. Nolan wrote that he'd noticed Megan flirting heavily with Jordan at a work event last year and thought it was inappropriate at the time. He said he'd actually mentioned it to Jordan back then, but Jordan had laughed it off as Megan just being friendly and affectionate with everyone. Nolan apologized for not pushing harder on it and said he should have trusted his instincts that something was off about her behavior. Jordan showed me the message, and I could see him starting to recognize all the signs he'd missed or explained away over the years. He said Megan always found excuses to touch him at gatherings, like adjusting his collar or brushing lint off his shirt. She monopolized his time at parties and would get upset if he talked to other people for too long. Jordan remembered she'd made subtle comments about me not being good enough for him that he'd dismissed as jokes, like saying he deserved someone who appreciated him more, or that I didn't understand him like she did. I watched Jordan piece together all the signs he'd ignored, and it hurt him worse than anything Megan had done directly. He kept going back through years of friendship, finding moments where she'd crossed lines he'd explained away. 3 days later, Megan posted on social media about how mental health struggles make you realize who your real friends are. She wrote this long thing about people abandoning you when you need help most, and how she was learning to love herself despite toxic people trying to bring her down. The post got dozens of comments from people who didn't know what actually happened, all saying how strong she was and how she deserved better friends. I watched the comments pile up for about an hour before Kira jumped in. She wrote that maybe people should get the full story before supporting someone who violated boundaries and lied about it. Then Nolan commented that he'd seen Megan's behavior firsthand, and it wasn't about mental health. It was about manipulation. 2 other friends from our group added their own comments about the camera footage and how Megan had been caught deliberately faking everything. Megan deleted the whole post within 20 minutes, but screenshots were already floating around our friend circle. Jordan got a message the next morning from someone named Alexander, who said Paul had given him our contact info. Alexander explained he used to be Paul's roommate 3 years ago when Paul and Megan were dating. He wrote that he felt sick when Paul told him what happened at our house because the exact same thing had happened to him. Megan had stayed over at their apartment multiple times and kept ending up in Alexander's bed instead of Paul's. Everyone told Alexander he was overreacting when he said it felt wrong and invasive. They said Megan had a medical condition, and he was being insensitive by making her feel bad about something she couldn't control. Alexander wrote that he eventually just moved out because he couldn't handle waking up to find his friend's girlfriend in his bed anymore, and everyone made him feel like the bad guy for it. He thanked us for finally proving he wasn't crazy, and said he'd spent 3 years wondering if he really had been too harsh on someone with a sleep disorder. I showed the message to Jordan and watched his face go pale. He realized Megan had been doing this for years to multiple people, perfecting her act and using the same excuses every time. I suggested maybe Jordan needed some space from the whole friend group to process everything that happened. He'd been friends with most of these people for over a decade, and finding out his best friend manipulated everyone was a lot to handle. But Jordan shook his head and said he wanted to face it directly instead of hiding. He sent out a group message inviting our closest friends to dinner at our house the following Saturday. Jordan wrote that he wanted to clear the air and make sure everyone understood what actually happened with Megan. He said he owed people explanations and apologies for his part in enabling her behavior. 8 people confirmed they'd come, which was basically our core friend group minus Megan. I spent Saturday afternoon cooking while Jordan paced around the house rehearsing what he wanted to say. When everyone arrived, you could feel the tension in the room. Nobody knew exactly what to expect, and half of them probably thought Jordan was going to defend Megan again. We all sat down in the living room with drinks, and Jordan stood up in front of everyone. He started by taking full responsibility for refusing to listen when people expressed concerns about Megan. He explained how the camera footage showed her fully awake and deliberately trying to get into our bedroom night after night. Jordan told them about Paul's testimony that Megan had done the exact same thing in her previous relationship and about Alexander having to move out because of her behavior. He apologized directly to me in front of everyone for making me feel like I was going crazy in my own home. Jordan's voice cracked when he said he'd chosen to believe Megan's lies over his wife's legitimate concerns, and he understood how much damage that caused. Kira spoke up and shared the story about Megan trying to cuddle with her husband during movie night. She admitted she'd convinced herself it was just awkward social skills because it seemed easier than believing someone they all liked would do something manipulative. 2 other friends nodded, and one guy named Darren said Megan had been way too touchy with his girlfriend at a party last year. His girlfriend had mentioned feeling uncomfortable, but Darren brushed it off as Megan just being affectionate with everyone. Another friend named Sophie admitted Megan had made comments about her boyfriend that crossed lines, but Sophie had ignored it because everyone said Megan was harmless. The group sat there realizing they'd all witnessed pieces of a pattern, but nobody had connected them because Megan kept everyone separate. Each incident seemed small on its own, but together they showed someone who deliberately pushed boundaries and played victim when called out. Darren asked if we were planning to take legal action against Megan for what she did. Jordan and I looked at each other and I shook my head. I told everyone we just wanted Megan out of our lives completely. The cameras and testimony were enough to protect ourselves and warn others, and dragging this through courts would just extend the nightmare. Jordan agreed and said we had the evidence we needed to make sure people knew the truth, and that was enough for us. 2 days later, Jordan's phone dinged with an email notification. He opened it and his expression went from confused to angry in about 3 seconds. He handed me his phone without saying anything. The email was from Megan, and it went on for paragraphs about how she did have real feelings for Jordan. She wrote that her subconscious was trying to be close to him through the sleepwalking, because she'd been in love with him for years. Megan claimed she never meant to hurt anyone, and the feelings just became too strong to control. She said maybe in another life they could have been together, and she hoped someday Jordan would understand she was just following her heart. I handed the phone back and told Jordan it was just another manipulation attempt. She was trying to reframe her predatory behavior as some romantic tragedy instead of the violation it actually was. Jordan nodded and said he saw right through it. He deleted the email and then spent the next hour blocking Megan on every platform he could think of. He sent messages to mutual friends saying he wouldn't attend any events where Megan were invited, and he needed them to respect that boundary. Most people responded right away saying they completely understood, and would make sure Megan wasn't included in group gatherings anymore. A few friends who still believed Megan's version of events sent concerned messages asking if Jordan was okay, and if I was controlling who he could see. Those friends stopped getting invites to things pretty quickly, and they drifted away from the group naturally. Our next therapy session focused entirely on me working through the anger and hurt from months of being dismissed. The therapist let me talk for almost 30 minutes straight about specific times Jordan had made me feel crazy. I listed moments where I'd brought up legitimate concerns, and he'd turned it around to make me seem jealous or paranoid. The therapist looked at Jordan and said my feelings were completely justified given what I'd experienced. She helped me explain to Jordan that his defensiveness hadn't just been frustrating. It had damaged my trust in him at a basic level. I told him there were nights I'd laid awake wondering if I really was being unreasonable, if maybe I was the problem in our marriage. Jordan listened without trying to defend himself or explain away anything. When I finished, he told the therapist he understood he'd gaslit me even though he hadn't meant to. He said he'd been so worried about seeming like a jealous or controlling husband that he'd overcorrected completely. Jordan admitted he thought trusting Megan and defending her made him a good friend and good person, but he'd never stopped to consider that trusting your wife isn't the same as being controlling. The therapist nodded and said that was an important distinction he'd clearly confused. She told Jordan that believing your partner when they express concerns isn't about control, it's about respect and partnership. Jordan committed right there in the session to believing me first in any future conflicts, instead of automatically defending other people. He said he'd learned the hard way that loyalty to friends shouldn't come at the cost of dismissing your spouse. A month after everything came out, Eliza drove up from the city to check on us again. She walked through our front door and immediately looked around like she was checking for signs of damage or tension. Jordan greeted her with a hug and told her we'd been doing a lot better lately. She studied both our faces carefully before relaxing and saying she could see the difference. We sat in the living room drinking coffee while Eliza asked questions about therapy and how we were handling everything. Jordan answered honestly about how hard it had been to accept what Megan did and how much work he was putting into rebuilding my trust. Later, Eliza pulled me into the kitchen while Jordan was in the bathroom and put her hand on my arm. She said she was really proud of how I handled the whole situation. She told me that most people would have just exploded and caused a huge scene, but I stayed calm and collected evidence that nobody could argue with. She said the camera footage and Paul's testimony gave me concrete proof that protected me from being painted as the jealous, crazy wife. I appreciated her saying that because there were definitely moments when I wanted to just scream at Megan or make a scene. Eliza hugged me tight and said she knew it took strength to be strategic instead of emotional, especially when I had every right to be furious. Paul and his girlfriend started coming over more often after the dinner confrontation. His girlfriend's name was Rachel, and she was really easy to talk to. The four of us would have dinner or watch movies, and it felt good to have friends who understood what we'd been through with Megan. Rachel mentioned one night that she'd always felt weird around Megan but couldn't figure out why. She said Megan would stand too close to Paul or touch his arm when talking, and it made Rachel uncomfortable. Rachel told us she thought maybe she was being insecure or jealous until Paul explained Megan's history. She said knowing about the pattern with Paul's old roommate and then what happened with Jordan made everything click into place. Paul nodded and said Megan was really good at making her behavior seem innocent or friendly, so people doubted their own reactions. Jordan and I both understood that feeling completely. We bonded over sharing stories about times Megan crossed boundaries and made us feel crazy for noticing. Rachel said she was glad we all had each other now and didn't have to deal with Megan's manipulation anymore. Jordan texted me one afternoon saying he'd just seen Megan at the grocery store. He said she spotted him in the produce section and started walking toward him with this hopeful look on her face. Jordan immediately turned and walked the other direction without acknowledging her. He grabbed what he needed from a different aisle and headed toward the checkout, but Megan followed him. She kept calling his name and saying they needed to talk. Jordan ignored her and kept walking faster. He said she followed him all the way out to the parking lot, talking the whole time about how she could explain everything if he'd just listen. Jordan got to his car and unlocked it while Megan stood there still trying to get him to engage. He climbed in, started the engine, and backed out while she was mid-sentence about missing their friendship. He drove away and watched her standing alone in the parking lot in his rearview mirror. When he got home, he looked shaken up, but also relieved that he'd held firm and not let her draw him into conversation. A few days later, I got a message from Megan on social media. The message was long and said she wanted to apologize to me directly and take full responsibility for everything she'd done. She wrote about how she'd been working on herself and seeing a therapist and understanding why her behavior was wrong. She said she knew I had no reason to trust her, but she wanted to at least try to make things right. I read the whole message and felt nothing but tired. I showed it to Jordan and he said it was probably just another attempt to get back into our lives. I remembered what our therapist said about engaging with manipulative people. She'd warned me that responding to Megan would just open the door for more contact and manipulation. Megan would see any response as permission to keep trying. I closed the message without replying and blocked her on that platform too. Jordan said I made the right call and we didn't owe her anything, not even acknowledgement of her apology. 3 months had passed since the dinner where everything came out. Jordan and I were sitting on the couch one evening when he suddenly said he felt really embarrassed about how blind he'd been. He talked about all the signs he'd missed or explained away over the months. I could see he was genuinely struggling with feeling stupid for not seeing what was so obvious in hindsight. I reminded him that manipulative people are experts at manipulation. I told him Megan targeted him specifically because she knew his personality. She knew he was loyal and kind and would defend a friend against accusations. She used his good qualities against him by making him think protecting her meant he was being a good person. Jordan nodded slowly and said he'd been so worried about seeming controlling or jealous that he went too far the other way. I squeezed his hand and said what mattered was that he saw the truth now and was working to make things right. We had a serious conversation that same week about boundaries for overnight guests. Jordan brought it up first, saying he wanted to establish clear rules so nothing like this could ever happen again. We agreed that anyone staying in our guest room needed to respect our privacy completely. That meant no coming into our bedroom for any reason unless it was an actual emergency. We also decided that we both had to be comfortable with whoever was staying over. If either of us felt weird about someone, we'd discuss it and find another solution. Jordan looked at me seriously and said he never wanted to put me in a position again where I felt unsafe or disrespected in our own home. He said our house should be our safe space and he'd failed to protect that. I appreciated him saying it out loud and taking responsibility. Kira called me one afternoon sounding frustrated and annoyed. She said Megan had tried to reach out to her through a mutual acquaintance. Megan apparently told the acquaintance that everyone had misunderstood the whole situation. She claimed the camera footage was taken out of context and didn't show the full picture. The acquaintance passed the message along to Kira thinking she might want to hear Megan's side. Kira shut it down immediately. She told the acquaintance she'd watched the videos herself multiple times and saw exactly what happened. She said there was no context that would make Megan's behavior okay. Kira also told the acquaintance not to pass along any more messages from Megan because she wasn't interested in reconnecting. She called to warn me that Megan might try the same approach with other friends. I thanked her for the heads up and for standing firm. Jordan came home from a work event looking lighter and more relaxed than he had in months. He told me the event had been really fun, and he'd actually gotten to have real conversations with his coworkers. I asked what he meant, and he explained that Megan used to monopolize all his time at work functions. She'd constantly interrupt when he was talking to other people, or pull him away to deal with some crisis only he could help with. His coworkers had apparently felt excluded, or like they couldn't get to know Jordan because Megan was always there. Nolan pulled Jordan aside at the event and mentioned how nice it was to actually talk to him without interruptions. Nolan said other people at work had noticed the difference too, and everyone seemed relieved. Jordan realized Megan hadn't just affected our home life, but had isolated him socially at work too. He said it felt good to rebuild those professional relationships. In therapy, I had a breakthrough about my own mental state over the past months. I realized I'd been doubting my own perceptions and instincts about everything, not just the situation with Megan. I second-guessed myself at work, with friends, even about small daily decisions. The therapist helped me see that being gaslit for months had damaged my confidence in my own judgment. Every time Jordan dismissed my concerns or made me feel paranoid, it chipped away at my ability to trust myself. I'd started questioning whether I was really seeing what I thought I was seeing in other situations too. Working through all of this in therapy helped me understand that my instincts had been right all along. The therapist validated that my concerns were always legitimate and reasonable. She helped me practice trusting my perceptions again and recognizing when someone was trying to make me doubt reality. Jordan surprised me on Friday by saying he'd booked us a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast 2 hours away. He said he wanted us to reconnect and focus on our marriage without any reminders of Megan or the mess she'd caused. We drove up Saturday morning and spent the weekend walking around the small town, eating good food and just talking. Jordan brought up what we both needed to feel secure going forward. I told him I needed him to believe me when I expressed concerns instead of automatically defending other people. He said he needed me to be patient with him as he learned to be a better partner and not dismiss my feelings. We talked about rebuilding trust and how it would take time, but we were both committed. The trip felt like a reset button for us. We came back home Sunday night feeling more connected than we had in almost a year. Monday morning, Jordan brought me coffee in bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress. He told me he was grateful I didn't give up on our marriage even when he was being stubborn and dismissive about everything. He said watching the camera footage was like seeing a completely different person than the friend he thought he knew for years. The whole experience made him question his judgment about everything in his life. He'd been replaying all their interactions in his head and seeing them differently now. Things he'd thought were innocent suddenly looked calculated and manipulative. He admitted he felt stupid for missing all the signs that seemed so obvious now. I squeezed his hand and told him manipulative people are good at what they do. That's why it works. We talked for almost an hour about how we both needed to move forward without letting this damage us permanently. We got back from the trip feeling more connected and committed to working through the damage together. Jordan started being more attentive to my feelings in ways he hadn't been before. When I expressed concerns about anything, he actually listened instead of immediately defending other people or dismissing what I said. He asked questions and tried to understand my perspective, even when it was uncomfortable for him. I noticed him making real effort to check in with me about decisions that affected both of us. He stopped assuming he knew what was best and started treating me like an equal partner whose opinions mattered. The change felt genuine because it showed up in small daily moments, not just big conversations. He'd pause before responding to things and actually consider what I was saying instead of reacting defensively. 3 days later, Alexander sent Jordan a long email thanking us for exposing Megan's pattern. He said he'd felt gaslit and crazy during his experience with her years ago. Everyone told him he was overreacting to innocent sleepwalking, and he started doubting his own perceptions. He moved out of his apartment instead of dealing with the situation because nobody believed him. Knowing other people experienced the same thing and that we believed him helped him feel less paranoid about his own judgment. Jordan showed me the email, and we both felt bad that Alexander had gone through that alone. Jordan wrote back saying he wished he'd known about it sooner, because maybe he would have recognized the pattern earlier. Alexander responded that he'd tried to warn people, but Megan was good at making herself look like the victim. She'd told everyone Alexander was cruel for abandoning his friend during a medical crisis. Our friend group settled into a new normal without Megan over the next few weeks. People started commenting that gatherings felt more relaxed now. Nobody was walking on eggshells or managing someone's constant need for attention and validation. Conversations flowed naturally without someone steering everything back to themselves. Several friends admitted they'd always felt slightly on edge around her, but couldn't articulate why until the pattern became obvious. Kira mentioned she used to feel exhausted after hanging out with Megan because everything required so much emotional energy. Another friend said she'd noticed Megan always positioned herself physically between couples at parties, but thought she was just being friendly. Now everyone could see how she'd been manipulating group dynamics the whole time. The relief in the group was obvious even though nobody wanted to seem mean by saying it out loud. Thursday afternoon, I found an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written on it in Jordan's handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter apologizing specifically for each time he dismissed my concerns and made me feel like I was being jealous or paranoid. He listed actual incidents with dates and what he'd said to me. He acknowledged that his words caused real harm and made me doubt myself in my own home. He wrote that he was committed to never making me doubt myself like that again. He said he understood why I'd felt isolated and alone, and he was sorry for contributing to that feeling. The letter was detailed and thoughtful in a way that showed he'd really been thinking about his actions. He didn't make excuses or try to justify anything. He just took responsibility for the damage he'd caused by refusing to listen to me. I read it twice and felt something shift inside me. The specific acknowledgement of each incident meant more than a general apology would have. I found Jordan in his workshop that evening and told him I'd read the letter. I said I could see he was genuinely working to change his behavior and rebuild trust between us. The couples therapy was helping us communicate better and address issues before they became major problems. I told him I appreciated that he was doing the work instead of just expecting me to get over it. He looked relieved but also sad, like he was still processing how badly he'd handled everything. I explained that rebuilding trust takes time, but I was willing to do it because I could see his effort was real. He hugged me and said he knew he didn't deserve my patience, but he was grateful for it anyway. We stood there in his workshop for a while just holding each other. 2 weeks later, Jordan got a call from someone in our friend group saying Megan had reached out to them. She claimed she'd been in therapy and wanted to make amends with Jordan. The friend was asking if Jordan wanted them to pass along her contact information. Jordan said no politely but firmly. He told them he wasn't interested in reconnecting with Megan and asked them not to pass along messages from her anymore. He explained that he needed to focus on his marriage and moving forward, not revisiting the situation. The friend understood and said they'd tell Megan not to contact them about it again. Jordan told me about the call right away instead of hiding it or handling it alone. That openness meant a lot to me. He said he wanted me to know he was setting clear boundaries and wasn't going to let Megan back into our lives in any way. 6 months after the confrontation, Jordan and I were in a much better place in our marriage. We'd learned to communicate more openly about things that bothered us instead of letting resentment build. He'd proven through consistent actions over time that he trusted and believed me. The therapy sessions continued even though things were better because we both wanted to maintain the progress we'd made. We went on regular date nights and actually talked about our feelings instead of just going through the motions. Jordan checked in with me about social plans and respected my boundaries without making me feel guilty. I felt safe in my own home again. The guest room didn't carry the weight of bad memories anymore. We'd even had other friends stay over without any weirdness or anxiety. Our relationship felt stronger because we'd worked through something difficult together instead of letting it destroy us. Kira hosted a dinner party on Saturday night and invited our whole friend group. She made a point of toasting to healthy boundaries and real friendships during dinner. Everyone laughed and agreed, raising their glasses. The toast acknowledged how much better the group dynamics were without someone constantly manipulating situations for attention. Nobody said Megan's name, but everyone knew what Kira meant. The evening felt light and fun in a way gatherings hadn't felt in a long time. People relaxed and enjoyed themselves without managing someone else's drama. Jordan and I left that night feeling grateful for the friends who'd supported us through everything, the ones who'd been willing to see the truth even when it was uncomfortable. Tuesday afternoon, I ran into Megan at a local restaurant while picking up takeout. She was standing near the counter and turned around right as I walked in. Her face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like regret. She walked over and said she wanted to apologize to me directly. She claimed she'd been working on herself in therapy and understood now that her behavior was wrong. I looked at her calmly and told her I appreciated she was getting help, but I wasn't interested in having any relationship with her. She started to say something else, but I walked away to place my order. She stood there for a minute, looking like she wanted to follow me, but then left the restaurant instead. I got my food and drove home feeling proud of myself for handling it without anger or drama. Jordan asked how the pickup went, and I told him about seeing Megan. He said he was proud of how I'd handled it with dignity and clear boundaries. He said he was glad we could both move forward without anger eating us up, even though what she did was completely wrong. I nodded and told him I felt the same way. The restaurant encounter had tested me, but I'd handled it exactly how I wanted to. No yelling, no drama, just clear boundaries, and then walking away. Jordan squeezed my hand across the dinner table and said he was learning from how I handled difficult situations. Over the next few weeks, our marriage continued getting stronger. Jordan became way more aware of boundaries with everyone, not just with situations involving women. He checked in with me before making plans that affected both of us. He listened when I voiced concerns instead of getting defensive. I learned to speak up more clearly about what bothered me instead of letting things build up. The therapy sessions helped us develop better communication patterns that actually worked. We talked through disagreements without one of us shutting down or getting angry. Our relationship felt solid in a way it hadn't before, like we'd built something stronger by working through the worst parts together. Paul called Jordan in early August to share big news. He and his girlfriend were getting engaged and wanted us to be in their wedding party. Jordan accepted immediately and congratulated him. That Saturday, we met them for a celebration dinner at their favorite restaurant downtown. Paul's girlfriend showed off her ring and talked excitedly about wedding plans. During appetizers, Paul raised his glass and made a toast about finding the right person and surrounding yourself with good friends who actually care about you. Then he grinned at me and added that at least they knew I was really good at spotting red flags and solving problems in smart ways. Everyone laughed and Jordan agreed, saying I'd definitely proven that skill. Paul's girlfriend said she felt lucky to have friends like us who would look out for them. The evening felt easy and fun, celebrating something happy without any weird tension or drama hanging over it. We left that night feeling grateful that something good had come from the mess with Megan. Paul had found someone who made him genuinely happy, and we'd all become closer friends through everything. A few weeks later, I came home from grocery shopping to find Jordan in the garage surrounded by wood pieces and tools. He'd set up a whole woodworking area without telling me. I asked what he was doing and he said he'd started a new hobby. He wanted to build things with his hands, create something real and lasting. Over the next month, he spent evenings and weekends out there working on a project he wouldn't let me see. He came inside with sawdust in his hair and on his clothes, looking tired but satisfied. Finally, in September, he brought a beautiful wooden jewelry box into the bedroom. The craftsmanship was incredible for someone who'd just started. He'd carved designs into the lid and lined the inside with soft fabric. Jordan handed it to me and said he wanted to make something meaningful that showed how much our relationship mattered to him. He said the box represented his commitment to us, something solid and carefully built that would last. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood and felt tears starting. The gift meant more than any store-bought thing, because he'd put real time and effort into creating it specifically for me. Around the same time, I started reaching out to friends I'd drifted away from during the months when Megan was around. She'd taken up so much space in our social life that other friendships had fallen by the wayside. I called my friend Rachel, who I used to meet for coffee every week. She answered right away and sounded happy to hear from me. We met up that Thursday, and she said she'd been wondering what happened but didn't want to intrude or seem nosy. I explained the whole situation with Megan and how it had finally gotten resolved. Rachel admitted she'd sensed something off about Megan the few times they'd met, but couldn't put her finger on what exactly. She was relieved things had worked out and said she'd missed our regular hangouts. Over the next few weeks, I reconnected with several other friends the same way. They were all supportive and glad to hear Jordan and I had worked through everything. A few mentioned they'd noticed me seeming stressed or distant, but hadn't known how to bring it up. Getting those friendships back felt like reclaiming parts of my life that had been slowly disappearing. In October, Kira sent a message to our whole friend group suggesting we plan a vacation together. She proposed renting a beach house for a long weekend. Everyone responded with excitement and we picked dates that worked for most people. The planning process itself felt different from it used to. Nobody had to manage anyone's drama or walk on eggshells about who could room with who. We just made straightforward decisions about logistics and what activities sounded fun. The actual trip in November was even better. We spent days on the beach, cooked meals together, played games at night, and just relaxed. Nobody created tension or demanded constant attention. One evening, while we were all sitting around the fire pit, Kira said out loud that this was what normal friendships were supposed to feel like. Everyone laughed and agreed. Jordan squeezed my shoulder and said he was glad we had friends who actually cared about each other instead of using people for validation. The whole weekend reminded me what healthy relationships looked like. When we got back from the trip, Jordan got called into his boss's office. I worried something was wrong, but he came home that evening grinning. He'd gotten promoted to senior project manager with a significant raise. His boss had praised his work quality and leadership over the past year. That night at dinner, Jordan said something that surprised me. He told me part of his success came from having more mental energy now. When Megan was constantly around, her demands for attention and validation had drained him even at work. He'd spent mental energy managing her feelings and dealing with the tension at home. Now that she was completely out of our lives, he could focus properly on his job and other things that actually mattered. His coworkers had noticed the change too. Several of them congratulated him the next day and mentioned he seemed much happier overall. One guy said Jordan had been distracted and stressed for months, but now seemed like himself again. Jordan realized he hadn't even noticed how much Megan's manipulation had affected every part of his life until it stopped. Around the same time Jordan got promoted, I started a new job I was really excited about. The position was exactly what I'd been looking for in my field, with better pay and opportunities for growth. Jordan celebrated with me without any of the weird insecurity Megan used to prey on. He never made comments about me being too busy or not having enough time for him. He asked about my projects and listened when I talked about work challenges. When I had to stay late or bring work home, he supported it instead of making me feel guilty. I realized how different this felt from before. During the Megan situation, she'd made little comments about me prioritizing career over Jordan, planting seeds of doubt about whether I was a good wife. Jordan had absorbed some of that messaging even if he didn't realize it. Now he genuinely wanted me to succeed and never questioned whether my achievements somehow threatened our relationship. Having that support made me feel secure in ways I hadn't fully appreciated before. In early December, we decided to host a dinner party at our house. I'd been avoiding having people stay over because the guest room still carried bad memories, but enough time had passed that I wanted to reclaim that space. We invited 6 friends, including Kira and her husband. I spent the day cooking and setting everything up. When people started arriving, I felt completely relaxed instead of anxious. The guest room was just a room again, not a source of stress. We ate dinner, played board games, and some people ended up staying over because they'd had too much wine. I offered the guest room to Kira and her husband without any weird feelings. The next morning, we all had breakfast together, and it felt perfectly normal. Nobody wandered into our bedroom. Nobody created drama or made things uncomfortable. I realized while cleaning up that I felt completely comfortable and safe in my own home again. The house belonged to Jordan and me, not to memories of someone who'd violated our space and trust. Right before Christmas, my sister Eliza came to visit for the holidays. She'd been checking in regularly since everything happened with Megan, worried about whether Jordan and I would actually work things out. The first evening she was there, she pulled me aside while Jordan was in the garage. Eliza said she could see how much stronger Jordan and I were as a couple now. The way we interacted felt different, more solid and genuine. She admitted she'd been really worried we might not make it through such a serious breach of trust. When someone dismisses your concerns that completely and makes you doubt your own perceptions, it damages something fundamental. But we'd proven her wrong by actually doing the work to fix what was broken. Jordan had made real changes in how he listened and respected my instincts. I'd learned to advocate for myself more clearly instead of hoping he'd just figure things out. Eliza hugged me and said she was proud of both of us for not taking the easy way out. Plenty of couples would have either ignored the problems or given up entirely. We'd chosen the harder path of actually addressing everything head-on and rebuilding from there. A few weeks later, Jordan and I stood in the hallway looking at the motion cameras we'd installed months ago. He reached up and started unscrewing the first one from the wall. I held the stepladder steady while he worked. He handed the camera down to me and moved to the next one. We didn't really need them anymore since Megan was completely out of our lives. Jordan stepped off the ladder and looked at the small pile of equipment we'd accumulated. He shook his head and said he was glad we had the documentation of everything that happened, but he was happier we didn't need surveillance in our own home anymore. I agreed and told him it felt good to take them down. We both started laughing about how completely absurd the whole situation had been. The fact that we'd needed cameras to prove someone was faking sleepwalking seemed ridiculous now that it was over. Jordan carried the equipment to the garage while I folded up the ladder. The hallway looked normal again without the little black boxes mounted near the ceiling. Our anniversary arrived in mid-January, and Jordan surprised me with dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. After we finished eating, he pulled out a card and handed it across the table. I opened it and read what he'd written inside. He thanked me for being patient while he learned to be a better partner. He wrote that almost losing my trust had taught him what really mattered in our marriage. He said he was grateful I'd given him the chance to make things right instead of just giving up on us. I felt my eyes get wet reading his words. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back and told me he meant every word. The whole experience with Megan had forced us to work through problems we might have ignored otherwise. We'd come out stronger because we'd actually dealt with the hard stuff instead of pretending everything was fine. About a month later, Kira called me with news she'd heard through mutual friends. Megan had apparently moved to a different city for what she called a fresh start. Nobody in our group had heard from her directly or knew exactly where she'd gone. Kira said it seemed like Megan had just quietly disappeared from everyone's lives. I told Kira that was probably for the best for everyone involved. We all silently agreed that maintaining distance from Megan was the healthiest choice. Our friend group had moved on, and nobody seemed interested in reaching out to her. The whole situation had revealed things about her behavior that made people uncomfortable. It was easier for everyone to just let her start over somewhere else without us. Jordan and I spent a Saturday afternoon looking at travel websites and planning a trip to Hawaii for next month. We scrolled through pictures of beaches and hotels. Jordan suggested we should also start thinking seriously about having kids in the next year or two. I looked up from the laptop and smiled at him. Our home felt peaceful and secure now. Our marriage was solid after working through everything with Megan. We'd both grown from the experience of dealing with something really difficult together. Life felt genuinely good for the first time in months. I was excited about our future and all the plans we were making. Jordan closed the laptop and pulled me close. We sat on the couch talking about baby names and what kind of parents we wanted to be. Everything felt right,